Hi everyone, this is Taryn Uruet from the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy and Leadership and Allies in Color. I am going to do a presentation on the referendum. The official date for voting is tomorrow, October 14. Early voting already started on October 3rd, I believe. Apparently, quite a lot of people have already voted early. But either ways, let me first start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, elders past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have made an important contribution to this land and community and continue to do so. This land is, was, and will always be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And today I'm coming from Nam. Bear with me while I switch screens to start. Right. Oops. There you go. So, before I go on, dive right into the topic, let me just make this disclaimer. I'm not here to tell anyone how to vote. I'm not here to convince anyone to vote either way, yes or no. That's not my job today. My job today is to provide you with enough context and information and to show you where to go, where you can go and get all the information that you need to make your own decision. Okay, so that's my goal. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let me show you where to actually find the official information with regards to the referendum and the voting that's happening tomorrow. Share screen. Sorry guys, bear with me for a minute, a second. Yeah. So let me go to so this is the official page where you go to find out information about voting and any other information that you need about the referendum. So that's the website, aec.gov.au/referendums, as you can see here. Okay. And then you can scroll down and it will tell you the question they're going to be asking you during, when you go to vote is they're making a proposed law to alter the constitution to recognize the first peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Yes or no? So that's the question for which you need to provide a yes or no answer. If you want to know, find where to vote, so find a place to vote. It's pretty easy, really. You go there, select when you want to vote, put in your postcode, yes, and then find polling places. Pretty straightforward, and you can see them all on the map. Okay, so that's pretty easy. And then if you scroll down a bit further, there's this official yes or no template. These are all authorized information, authorized by parliamentarians. So, and this is the piece of document you would have received in your mailbox, but in case you didn't pay attention to it, it's here. They have it in various languages. I'm going to click the English version. And there you go. Okay, all the information with regards to voting for yes, voting for no. Let me zoom out. There you go. All the information that you need is right there. Okay, so it's a good place for you to start if you haven't figured out what you're going to do tomorrow. Okay, share screen again. Screen. Oops. That's not it. That is not it. This. Pretty sure it's this. Yes, it is. Here we go. All right. Brief introduction about myself. I'm the CEO and founder of Allies in Color and the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy, and Leadership. What is Allies in Color? Who's Allies in Color? Allies in Color, we're independent national peak advocacy and research body for advancing culturally and racially marginalized Australian representation in positions of power. We have three target areas. Basically, it's governance, politics, and entrepreneurship, because that is where we're really, very much behind in terms of representation. So that's why we're focusing on those three areas. So as part of our efforts to make an impact on the politics side of things, we've got the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy, and Leadership, in short, COMPEL. So there's a lot of stuff that we have been doing over the last 2 years. Just this year alone, this is an example of some of the work that we've done. So we do a lot of advocacy and activism work. We're currently having a very important piece of research underway when we're partnered with University of New South Wales and University of Melbourne. And basically, we are looking into the political and media literacy of Chinese and South Asian migrant communities in Australia. We are initially starting off with these two community groups, and we'll spread out further. But this is where we're going to be starting because there's a lot of ground to cover. So that's underway. We've pushed out surveys, and so if you belong to either of those communities, please, we implore you to please do the survey. I'll provide the links at the bottom of the video or in the description box somewhere where you can access it easily. We also conducted many consultation sessions around the multicultural framework review. You may or may not have already heard of it. We also conducted workshops to teach people how to actually make a submission, because not everybody knows how to make a submission to the government. As much as the government wants public input into the multicultural framework review, people need to understand how to read what the government is asking and understand it, and how to write a submission. So we did workshops on that. We also collected data on the ethnic representation in the last federal parliament, and we found that we've got 8% ethnically diverse people elected into the federal parliament. You would have seen that all over the newspapers, that number. This year, we also had a first ever of its kind in the country, a pilot program, Political Engagement Literacy and Public Office Leadership Program, that is underway by COMPEL. We also did a national tour, networking events to foster intercultural bonds and encourage political engagement. That's just some of the work that we've done. Going back to me, brief introduction if you don't already know who I am. I have got professionally, I've got a media and technology background, originally from Singapore. Now I'm an Australian. Even though my professional experience has been in the media and tech industry, privately, I have done extensive amount of political campaigning work across Singapore, United States, and Australia. I'm quite well known for the campaign that I ran for Bernie Sanders here in Australia when he ran for president in 2016 and also 2020. And what else? Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of collecting data. I'm a big fan of figuring out what's not working within the systems within which we operate in and trying to fix it to simplify things. So yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover. So if you want to know more about me, connect with me on LinkedIn or something. Okay, let's get on with the program. Now, the referendum. Here is my experience, especially in the migrant community. All these words, treaty, constitution, indigenous rights, a lot of people don't understand them. A lot of people don't really understand what is treaty, and a lot of people don't even understand what is a constitution and how it all, interacts. And yet these are some of the wordings that constantly come up when we talk about the referendum. So if people don't understand the words, then it's kind of hard to talk about the referendum. So I'm going to break it down, simplify it the best of my abilities. And in the midst of it all, I'm going to take a sip of water here and there because I've been doing a lot of these workshops and I'm slowly losing my voice. So, and I'm literally the only person doing this presentation today. So, so here's what we're going to cover in today's presentation. I'm going to give you a historical background. I'm going to talk to you about what is treaty, and I'm going to talk to you about the Treaty of Waitangi because that tends to come up a lot. We do tend to compare what Australia is doing with what New Zealand is doing. So it's important for you to understand the treaty within the context of how New Zealand has done it, and then what is applicable to Australia and what's not. So treaty within the Australian context. The Australian Constitution, I'll briefly touch on that. And then, of course, ultimately the Voice to Parliament referendum. I'll go through the Uluru statement as well. And then last but not least, arguments for the yes and no votes. My job here is to provide information only. I'm not here to convince you to vote either ways, okay? That's your decision, your choice. So as I talk to you, I'm going to refer to my notes because there's just so much to get through, guys. So please bear with me. Please bear with me 1 second. Share screen this one. Okay, so we are going to start with giving you a brief history of our First Nations people. So Australia's Indigenous people, they're often referred to as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They have a rich and diverse history spanning tens of thousands of years, okay? In fact, they've got a history dating back on the continent, dating back to at least 65,000 years. And they're amongst the world's oldest living culture. They have this unique relationship to land, okay? So central to their culture is land, okay? Because they have a deep spiritual connection, and that connection is known as country. So land, dream time, and sacred and timeless spiritual realm, they're all very integral to their identity and worldview. The indigenous knowledge of land, including its flora and fauna, has been passed down through generations, and it's so important for the survival in Australia's diverse and often harsh environments. And, you know, when the bushfires came, well, whenever the bushfires come, a lot of people tend to look to the indigenous wisdom in that area to help them rectify the bushfires. So, or to prevent them from happening in the future, not rectify, sorry. So now, in 1770s, we had the British explorer, Captain James Cook. May or may not have heard of this guy, Captain James Cook. He landed on the east coast of Australia. And that sort of started, you know, the first beginning of the European contact with indigenous people. And then over the next century or so, European settlers, they established colonies, and that was sort of the beginning of the end of the indigenous culture, because of the word terra nullius. Now, terra nullius is a Latin term that translates to nobody's land or land belonging to no one. Okay, and this word was very, and it still is very significant, because what had happened was basically these settlers that came into Australia, they basically reported back their monarch that this land was unoccupied. They lied and they said, no, this land belongs to nobody, therefore we can just go and do whatever we want with it. But that was not the truth. Our First Nations people were living there. They still do. They still are. And so just that lie, that reporting that it was nobody's land, just played a huge part in it's a big part of why we're here today, why we are having to vote on this referendum. And hopefully the more information I give you, you'll get a better idea of why that is so. Now, from the 19th century onwards, there were a lot of government policies that were made that led to the forced removal of indigenous children from their families. And there's a terminology, it's called stolen generations. This practice had a long-term traumatic effect on their community. And believe it or not, it's still an ongoing issue in some of these indigenous communities. But I won't delve too deep into that. That's just too much to go through. Land rights and reconciliation. Indigenous people have been fighting for the recognition of their land rights and cultural heritage for a long time. There have been lots of land rights movements and legal actions, and they've made some significant gains in the recognition of indigenous land ownership. But you know, despite all these historical injustices, indigenous cultures have demonstrated resilience and vitality. And today, indigenous Australians contribute to the art and music and dance and literature and so many other fields. But there's a lot of disparities when it comes to health, education, employment, etc. I'll also talk about that a little bit later, so I won't go into that too much right now. Right. So that is a very short and brief history of our Indigenous Australian. I don't think this slide does any justice to the vast and great history of our First Nations people, but you know, that's all I've got time for with regards to this presentation, so I'm going to move it along. So you would have heard a lot about Treaty of Waitangi. You would have heard a lot about that. So what exactly is a treaty? Sorry, let me get my notes. So a treaty is basically an agreement between two parties. Oh, sorry, between parties, not necessarily to follow like a specific course of action or conduct, and it's basically an agreement. It's a form of agreement by parties that are bound by international law. So it could be states, or it could be international organizations that enter into a treaty. So it's a type of agreement. Now, throughout history, there have been several types of treaties. I'll talk about the three. First one, especially in the context of Indigenous colonization, I have to add. So first one is the treaties of cession. This is where territories are ceded and result in creation of reserves and protection of some rights. That's one type of treaty. And then the other type of treaty that you have is peace and friendship treaties, they're called, which sort of builds military alliances, prevents wars, and facilitates trade. And then the third kind of treaty is recognition and self-government agreements. So it's basically a coexistence agreement that creates parallel governance arrangements in the same country. I'm going to take a sip of water as I go along. Sorry guys, I'm slowly losing my voice, so I'm doing my best to talk. So there are three kinds of treaties when it comes to the Indigenous colonization. In the context of Indigenous colonization, one is called treaties of cession. And then you have peace and friendship treaties. And then the last one is recognition and self-government treaties, coexistence agreements that create parallel governance arrangements in the same territory. So now the third one is the one that is more relevant to what's happening here in Australia, which is the recognition and self-government agreement. That's this form of treaty that we're talking about in the context of the referendum. Okay, the referendum is not a treaty. Don't get that confused. I'm going to be talking about treaty because there are some people that say they prefer a treaty rather than this constitutional recognition. So, which is why it's important for you to understand what exactly is a treaty so that you can make sense of the rest of it. So, let's see. Okay. So the Treaty of Waitangi. Okay, so how did that come about and how was it negotiated? So this Treaty of Waitangi is a very important document in New Zealand's history. It was signed in 1840s between representatives of the British Crown and Maori chiefs, they're also known as Rangatira, in the Bay of Islands in New Zealand. Go on, there you go. So in the early 19th century, European settlers, traders, missionaries, they started arriving in New Zealand. And then they started to interact with the indigenous Maori population more and more. And because there was a lot of these sorts of interactions and there was a lot of European presence, there was a lot of concerns with regards to land ownership and sovereignty and governance, okay, because of the interactions. So now the British government became very interested in establishing a formal relationship with the Maori chiefs. And they were very interested in asserting British sovereignty over New Zealand to prevent other colonial powers from gaining a foothold in the region. Okay, so in 1839, this guy called Captain William Hobson, he had instructions to negotiate a treaty with the Maori chiefs. Now, you can already tell the difference here. When we talked about terra nullius, the British representatives, they reported there was no one. So because there was no one, there's no one to negotiate any kind of treaties with. But in the case of New Zealand, that was not the case. The Maori chiefs were there, they were recognized, and therefore they had to go through the process of negotiating treaties, which is what they did with the Maori chiefs. Okay, so there was a lot of negotiations, and then what ended up happening was there's an English version and the Maori version of the Treaty of Waitangi, but basically it had three key principles. Okay, one was cession of sovereignty. What does that mean? It means Maori chiefs were ceding sovereignty to the British Crown. I won't go. So there's some issue with the Maori version and the English version. Apparently there was some the wordings meant different things. I won't go into all those details, guys. Google it up if you want to learn more. But basically, there are three key principles within the context of the New Zealand version of the treaty. There's a cession of sovereignty, where they were said the Maori chiefs ceded sovereignty to the British Crown. Secondly, protection of Maori rights. The treaty guaranteed Maori chiefs and their tribes the rights and privileges of British subjects, while allowing them to retain control over their lands, forests, and fisheries. And then last but not least is governance. The treaty established a British government in New Zealand. And so William Hobson became the first governor and provided for the appointment of a Maori king or queen. So those were the key principles of the treaty that was negotiated. Now, that is the New Zealand version of treaty. And the reason why they had a treaty is because the people of New Zealand the first people of New Zealand were acknowledged that they were there. Nobody lied and said it's a no man's land. Okay? Now, I should talk about the challenges and interpretations. So, interpretations of the treaty's provisions have sort of evolved over time. And then there have been numerous legal cases and debates about its meaning and intent, especially regarding sovereignty, land rights, and duty of the crown to protect Maori interests, etc. So treaty is not without its issues. It still has issues in New Zealand. So it's still, the Treaty of Waitangi is still, is quite central to the discussion of Maori rights, land claims, and the relationship between Maori and the New Zealand government. And it's still sort of shaping New Zealand's legal and political landscape, okay? So that's the nature of the treaty in the New Zealand context. So if anytime anyone wants to make a comparison to why, the Australian context and the New Zealand context, that's the information that you need. Now, negotiating treaty in the Australian context. So why can't Australia negotiate treaties with its Indigenous people like New Zealand or even Canada? Canada has done it. There's a big difference when it comes to what has happened here in Australia and especially what's happened in New Zealand. So, like I said before, in Australia, there was no treaty or agreement made during the period of British colonization because terra nullius, okay? Secondly, legal framework. The legal and constitutional frameworks for each of our countries differ. Again, in Australia, there is no express provision for treaty making with Indigenous people in the Australian Constitution, okay? But then in New Zealand, they've got constitutional and legal provisions that acknowledges the importance of treaties. So the constitution that New Zealand has recognizes the importance of treaties. Our Australian constitution doesn't even talk about that. Okay? So legal framework wise, very different. Next, recognition of sovereignty. The recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination has evolved very differently, right? New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi, and in Australia, however, again, we don't really have, any federal level approach to treaty negotiations. Political will is also different. In New Zealand, treaty negotiations have been part of a broader commitment to reconciliation. In Australia, as you may or may not have known, there have been a lot of discussions about treaties and agreements and, but never really went anywhere. So here we are with the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Also, I guess you have to take into consideration community preferences, okay? So within Indigenous communities, they themselves might have varying preferences regarding treaty negotiations, and we have seen that played out when it comes to the referendum, okay? Some may advocate for treaties, some others might advocate or prefer some other mechanism for achieving recognition, okay? So treaty versus constitutional amendment debate, okay? Okay, let's see. Yeah, I've covered that. Now, you may or may not have heard of the term closing the gap. So basically, it's about how do our Indigenous people fare compared to non-Indigenous people in Australia. That's basically what that is. And there are huge discrepancies. There's a lot within the closing the gap information that I need to provide you with. I can't do all of that. So I've provided the link to the website, which is this. I'll give you a second to take it in. And then I'm going to give my voice a little bit of a break and let you watch this video about closing the gap. It's very important that you understand this, because this is also a big reason why, big argument for why the federal government is pushing for constitutional recognition of a voice to Parliament, okay?
The flexibility of a Ubank offset for your renos. With the right loan, you'll feel right at home. Ubank.
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Today truly is an historic occasion.
Australia has taken measures to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in a 10-year strategy signed by federal and state governments. The aim is to improve life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people after efforts over the past decade did little to budge their shorter life expectancy and worse health prospects.
We didn't look at the gap through the eyes of Indigenous Australians. We told Indigenous Australians what the gap was that we were going to close, and somehow thought they should be thankful for that. That was wrong-headed. That wasn't the way to do it.
Aboriginal Australians make up 3% of the population, according to government statistics. That's about 700,000 people in a population of 25 million, dating back 50,000 years before the British arrived. The minority tracks near the bottom in almost every economic and social indicator. Their life expectancy is 8 years shorter than for non-Indigenous people, at 72 years for men and 76 years for women.
I think it's going to have a very meaningful impact on how we progress to ensure that young Indigenous boys and girls can grow up in this country with the same expectations as non-Indigenous boys and girls in this country. That's what we want to see. That's what it's all about.
The government's revamp comes after a review of a decade under a previous strategy showed that only 2 of 7 targets had been met. The new targets were designed following consultation with its first people.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know what is best for our communities, not governments. And this national agreement means that decisions of government on closing the gap need to be negotiated and agreed with us.
It's not an easy road, and there's still a long road ahead of us to achieve that. But what we're announcing today, I think, will make a very meaningful impact on achieving that journey together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Here we go. And with that, we now move on to the Australian Constitution. Before I move on to the Australian Constitution, I have to give you a little bit more information about closing the gap. So basically, closing the gap, as you've seen from the video, it's an Australian government policy initiative aimed at addressing and reducing the disparities in life outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, okay? Now, the government has actually set specific measurable targets within these areas. And as you have watched in the videos, the targets haven't been achieved. So there are a total of 17 target areas, and you can find out more about those 17 target areas in the website that I previously showed, but I thought I should just mention this little bit about closing the gap. You know, we'd like to think that all of us in Australia have the same sort of, lifestyle and living standards, but that's couldn't be further from the truth. And also, I'd like to mention something that really struck me about the Indigenous history. Sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit. I really should have mentioned that before. I came here as a migrant myself. So I didn't understand a whole lot about Indigenous people or Indigenous history or, really not that much. But this really struck me because I learned that Indigenous people weren't allowed to earn money until 67 or 1970s? That's not too long ago. I have siblings that age, so that's a significant loss in intergenerational wealth as well. So for me, that really hit me close to home because it's something that I could relate to. I was like, oh my God, if my parents weren't able to weren't allowed to earn money, can you imagine that? So this is just one of the things that, we need to understand as migrants, that there are many of us that like to compare our struggles to the ones that Indigenous people are going through. But in order to make that sort of, judgment, you first really need to thoroughly understand what actually went on in the Indigenous people's lives here in Australia. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of migrants don't understand. And I used to be one of them. So, again, this is not for me to entice you to vote whatever way. This is me just giving you enough information so that you understand the context, okay? Okay, I'll move on from that. So let's move on to the Australian Constitution. The Australian Constitution is basically like the birth certificate of Australia, okay? You can consider it in a simplest form, you can consider it that way. It basically outlines the various powers of the levels, each level of government. You've got the federal, state, local government. I think we've seen this. So how has the Australian Constitution failed the Indigenous people? Very, very important for you to know this, because the Constitution, like I said, is the birth certificate of this nation. It also specifies what rights and privileges you're supposed to have as an Australian. guess what? It actually doesn't specify it. So if you're a citizen of Australia, it doesn't actually specify what rights and privileges you have, but that's besides the point. We're talking about Indigenous people now. So how has the Australian Constitution failed the Indigenous people? Okay, let's go through that. Now, first of all, lack of recognition. The Constitution does not explicitly recognize the presence or the contribution of Indigenous people, their culture, or their unique place in history. So this has been significant. This has been problematic. And a lot of people don't know about this particular section, often referred to as the race power section in the Constitution. It's actually been used to justify discriminatory policies against Indigenous people in the past. It allowed the federal government to make laws based on race, which has been employed in policies and had a detrimental effect on Indigenous communities. See the word treaty is coming up again, lack of treaty. Unlike countries like New Zealand and even Canada, which have got negotiated treaties with Indigenous people, Australia never established any formal treaty. Okay, so that's that. And then you've got land rights. Now, Indigenous land rights are primarily addressed through legislation and what's known as the Native Title Act. However, it's not done through the Constitution. So some argue that the constitutional recognition of land rights would provide greater protection and clarity. The Constitution also doesn't ensure adequate Indigenous representation in the national parliament. Okay. But actually, in the last federal election, Indigenous representation in parliament actually has gone up. So they have actually done pretty well, at least from the data that we collected shows. So yeah, I'll move along. Limited self-determination. Indigenous self-determination is something that is not enshrined in the Constitution. And many Indigenous Australians, they want greater control over their own affairs, but the Constitution doesn't support this right. Access to justice is also another way the Constitution has failed Indigenous Australians. They face disparities in terms of justice, including in the criminal system. There's a high level of imprisonment of Indigenous people in certain parts of Australia, and yeah. And finally, cultural preservation. Cultural preservation is very important, and the Constitution does not explicitly protect Indigenous cultural rights, which other countries protect. Australia hasn't done it. So these are all the ways in which our Constitution actually has failed our Indigenous people. And so here we are, finally. The referendum itself. Where is it? Okay. So the question you're going to be asked when you vote is the proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognize the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Yes or no? That is the question. Now, Uluru Statement is yet another word that you would have seen popping around. What is it? Okay. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, it's a document that was created, that came out of this historic gathering of Indigenous delegates, meaning representatives. And this gathering was held in Uluru in Central Australia in May 2017. There has been some report that the gathering didn't happen in Uluru, but happened elsewhere. But look, I won't go into that, okay? But there was a gathering of Indigenous delegates, and they came together and they came up with this Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, the Uluru Statement represents the aspirations and the views of the delegates and outlines a vision for the future of Indigenous Australian. So what does the document include? First and foremost, document includes the voice. The Uluru Statement calls for the establishment of the First Nations voice to Australian Parliament. The voice would be a constitutional enshrined body that allows Indigenous Australians to have a say in policies and laws that affect their lives. So that's one. They want a voice. Okay? 2, Makarrata. If you haven't heard of it, please Google it up, but I'll do a brief explanation. Makarrata. The Uluru Statement also calls for a Makarrata Commission to oversee the process of this truth-telling and agreement-making. Now, Makarrata is an Aboriginal word meaning process of dispute resolution, truth-telling, and moving forward after a period of conflict. So New Zealand also has something similar. I forget what it's called. They have like an independent, like a commission to make sure that the agreements that they've had, you know, are still being honored. So that's kind of sort of similar to the Makarrata Commission. And thirdly, constitutional reform. The representatives of the delegates, they expressed the need for constitutional reform to recognize the unique status and contributions of Indigenous Australians. So basically asking for a change or amendment to the Australian Constitution to formally acknowledge Indigenous rights and representation. So it's like a visionary document that was created in consultation with delegates and representatives, Indigenous delegates and representatives. So that's the Uluru Statement from the heart. I've got the website there at the bottom, so if you want to read more about it, you absolutely can. Right, now we're going to talk about the actual process of, let me move my, amending the Constitution. How do I, okay, so it is not easy to make changes to the Constitution, and it's deliberately done so that you don't get too many changes in the constitutions, otherwise things can get chaotic, right? So I won't go through the first few steps. Basically it talks about proposal being made, and then, you know, public being notified. And as you know, that part where public is being notified is basically the notification of when the vote on the referendum is going to happen, which is October 14th. So everyone heard about that. And then October 14th is when you vote, right? Now, in order for the vote to be successful, or sorry, the referendum to be successful, a vote on the referendum to be successful, you do need the double majority requirement. Okay, so what is the double majority requirement condition to be met in order for the referendum to be successful? This means that the amendment to the Constitution must be approved by majority of voters across the nation. So nationally, there needs to be a majority of people that say yes, okay? That's number one. Now, the second requirement is that majority of voters in a majority of states. The proposed amendment must be approved by a majority of voters in at least 4 of the 6 states. So it's not good enough to have a majority of voters across the nation, but you must have a majority in at least 4 of the 6 states. So if only and if these 2 conditions are met, then the referendum is successful. Otherwise, it's not. So it's not that easy, okay? So if it is successful, then there's this, you know, ceremonial thing where you submit to the monarch sort of rubber stamps it, and then it sort of gets included in the Constitution. That's basically what the process is. And then here we are. Arguments for the yes and the no. This is just, look, this is not a full list of all the no and the yes arguments. I've picked out whatever I could pick out within the short period of time. So now there are many reasons why people say you shouldn't vote. You should vote no. Okay. First of all, foremost, you have concerns about division. Okay, some people worry that creating a separate Indigenous voice to Parliament may lead to division within our Australian society. That it may create a us versus them sort of a, paradigm. Secondly, there are questions about representations. Critics of the proposals have raised questions about how the members of the Indigenous voice would be selected and whether they would be accountable to all Australians. So, there's some doubt around whether is it truly going to be representative. And then there are legal and constitutional issues. Some people express concerns that they worry that it could conflict with existing constitutional arrangements or create confusion. Next, some people prefer an alternate solution. And they believe things like treaty first. You would have heard of it. I don't want to, I don't support the enshrinement of the voice in the Constitution. I want a treaty. You would have heard people say that. Some people say that, or some people saying that being reported in the news. Okay, so some people prefer alternate solutions. They don't want this one. And then finally, a desire for national unity. Some people argue that promoting national unity and reconciliation should be the primary focus, and this Indigenous voice, it's sort of giving Indigenous people special treatment. Okay, so these are the arguments for the no vote. So here are some of the some prominent Indigenous leaders that are advocating for the no vote. So you've got Jimmy Everett, Puralia Minamata. He's an Aboriginal elder, and he says Aboriginal people need to draw up our own constitution. We need to draw up our own treaty because we have never ceded our sovereignty, and we should enact it instead of going to the colonizers and becoming part of their system. So he's proposing, I don't like this solution, we need alternate solutions. This isn't it, okay? That's his reason for campaigning for the no vote. Senator Jacinta Price, she feels that this referendum has been very divisive. Okay. And then you've got Senator Lydia Thorpe. She basically proposes other solutions as well. She's in favor of treaty more than constitutional recognition. Arguments for the yes vote. There are plenty. I've just picked out a few. So if I haven't, please don't go at me for not giving you a convincing no argument and a yes argument. Like I said, I'm not here to convince anyone, okay? I've already given you the resource to the AEC website. Please, it's got all the details that you need. I'm just putting out a few pointers. Okay, so yes. Why yes? Why should you vote yes? Addressing historical injustices. Okay, so Australia has a history of colonization and mistreatment of Indigenous people. So we believe, they believe that the Indigenous voice to Parliament is an important step in acknowledging these historical injustices. Honestly, the biggest injustice, I have to say, was the Terra Nullius, saying that they didn't exist when they actually absolutely did, and they should have by right negotiated treaties back then. Anyways, empowering Indigenous communities. The Indigenous voice would provide a platform for Indigenous Australians to have a direct say in policies and directions that affect their communities. It allows them to shape policies related to education, health, justice, and so on and so forth. Closing the gap, very important. Now, there are significant disparities in health, education, employment, and living conditions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Supporters of the yes vote argue that Indigenous voice to Parliament can help to close the gaps by advocating for policies and programs that address these inequalities. As we saw earlier in the video, a lot of the target areas, the targets haven't been met. So advocates of the yes vote believe that the constitutional recognition would close the gap. Cultural preservation. Indigenous voice promotes the preservation and celebration of Indigenous cultures, language, and traditions. Building a more, inclusive democracy. By giving Indigenous Australian a formal mechanism for representation and participation in decision-making, the Yes campaigners believe that it can contribute to a more inclusive and representative democracy. Okay, that's the next one. Consultation and collaboration. The Indigenous voice is designed, according to Yes campaigners, designed to work in collaboration with government bodies and institutions. They believe it can enhance the quality of decision-making by ensuring that policies are developed in consultation with people who are most affected by them. There's also this, international example. Some supporters also point to successful models of Indigenous representations in other countries like New Zealand and Canada, where similar mechanisms have led to improved outcomes for Indigenous population. So I'm not 100% not sure about Canada, but in New Zealand, I think, as was mentioned before, they do have it in their constitution to recognize treaties. We haven't got that. I don't know if that's a model that you can necessarily compare, but maybe you could. I don't know. This one I'm not 100% very clear on. Basically, they're saying it's important to note that the Indigenous Voice to Parliament proposal is designed to complement, not replace, existing democratic institutions. It aims to provide a stronger voice for Indigenous Australians within the current parliamentary framework. Right. And here are the famous prominent Indigenous elders and campaigners voting on the for the yes vote. And this is Noel Pearson. My last pitch on behalf of this referendum campaign is to say to those Australians who are undecided, who are still thinking about yes or no vote, don't slam the door on the children. He's imploring communities. Linda Burney, MP, she's the current Minister for Indigenous Australians. Voting no takes us nowhere. We must open our hearts to yes and the hope of a better future. So that's that, guys. That was a presentation. Here's my contact info. If you're interested in finding out more, please feel free to reach out. Stop sharing.